Welcome back to Great Decisions. Great to see you all here. As you probably well know, because I do this every darn year, my name is Tim DeRoche. I am the Director of Programs for WorldOregon. And we're very, very excited. Among other reasons, our topics this year are so topical. Everything that we're talking about, you're seeing daily above the fold, if you actually get the old growth media delivered to your home. But it's also the stuff of noise that we're hearing about everywhere and every which way. And I'll take this down in a minute, but the main thing I'm going to want to do right now is talk about what we have coming up before I introduce today's speaker. We have this weekend, just as an FYI, we are doing one of our Teach the World series, which is part of our K-12 program. We are doing a workshop at the Muslim Educational Trust on understanding Islam, which is giving K-12 teachers curriculum and tools to talk about Islam, diversity, and multiculturalism in their classrooms as we see the landscape of our classrooms changing throughout the region. So anything I talk about you can find about on WorldOregon.org, which is our website. Next week also, we are doing a volunteer info session. So if you're interested in hosting international visitors in your home or coming into our office and helping facilitate international dialogue and connecting Oregonians to the world, you can come down to Cafe Umbria next week, have a cup of coffee, and learn about all the different options. And if you missed last week's very, very wonderful Great Decisions with Mary Carlin Yates and Barb Stevenson, as we speak, it is being uploaded to our YouTube channel. You go to YouTube and Google WorldOregon, and you can find it. And next week, mark your calendars for Laura Robson, who spoke for us a number of years ago. Actually, I think it was the same year that today's speaker, Elliott, spoke when we were over in Shattuck Hall. She's speaking on the Middle East and regional disorder. We are extremely excited about this year's International Speaker Series, which we have up here on the screen. Hopefully you've all received information on what promises to be an engaging and inspiring season focusing on youth empowerment and global leadership and social change for the next generation. It is kicking off March 3rd at the Newmark Theater. We are moving into the Newmark. It is putting you closer to the speaker. And we're kicking off with former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro. So we're darn excited about that. You can buy your series tickets now. 2/3 of the seats are already filled, and it will sell out. So just a reminder, all series tickets are sold through Portland5.com. Grab one of these sunny yellow postcards on your way out today and put it on your refrigerator. It'll remind you to get your tickets. If you haven't renewed your membership, now is the time, as members receive 10% on most of these series seats. If you requested physical tickets, they should be mailed to you within 7 to 10 days, and you should have already received through email the print-at-home versions. So let me take this off so it's not shining in Elliott's face throughout the talk. Isn't technology wonderful? Anyway, so today's speaker, we're looking at the U.S. and Mexico. You haven't heard anything about that lately, have you? Elliott Young is professor of Latin American and Borderlands history at Lewis and Clark College in Portland. His most recent book, Alien Nation, Chinese Migration in the Americas, the Coolie Era to World War II, is a transnational history exploring the construction of the idea of the illegal alien throughout the Americas. He also just told me that he's working on a new book. He's on sabbatical. It is on immigration detention. So, another prescient topic. Young has published 2 other books on Borderlands history. Caterino Garza's Revolution on the Texas-Mexico Border and Continental Crossroads, a volume of essays by new scholars in the field. His articles have appeared in a variety of academic journals, including Past and Present, the Western Historical Quarterly, and Mexican Studies Estudio Mexicanos. And I remember that a number of years ago, I think it was BuzzFeed, said that his Cuba study program was one of the hottest college classes in the nation. Isn't that true? So we have so many great people in our backyard. Give Elliott Young a round of applause. And reminder, we are streaming. So, and when we get to Q&A, you need to be on the mic. You need to watch your P's and Q's. And don't worry, it's all about democracy and conversation. So, thanks.
Thanks, Tim. So do I need this microphone? No, I've got this other microphone. So BuzzFeed, yeah, I mean, some people after the recent news would say it's all fake news, so I'm not sure it was the hottest course, but I wanted to start today with where we're gonna end up, because I'm really gonna do a history of the US-Mexico border and the relationship between the United States and Mexico. But our esteemed president has, for the last few years and recently also said that a country without borders is no country at all. And I wanted to just ask if any of you would care to comment on that statement. Is this true? Would you take issue with that statement? What does that statement, which caused consternation among some, mean to you? And what would you have to say about it? Yes?
I think it seems self-evident.
Because?
Well, because it seems to me that you define a country by geography, by a common legal system in the country, and by a common heritable culture that looks back to the origins of that country. And you lose in those three, and you chip away. When you lose the borders, then it just kind of smears on into something else.
Yes.
Depends whether you're talking about borders as a physical item or something on a map. Certainly, Europe, under the common market, does not have borders in the sense of Trumpism. There's no physical barriers. You can go anywhere you want, but they're countries. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure what the prior man had in mind, but that's how I would explain it.
Anyone else would care to offer an opinion?
I think there's probably some integrity to sub-regional characterizations. I forget the author of called American Nations, where he describes Texas and northern Mexico as culturally similar. That northern Mexico is actually different from the rest of Mexico on the one hand, and that being legitimized now with the Maquiladoras and that economic integration. So yeah, you need a border and countries, but we've kind of subsumed that in certain contexts.
Right, and it raises the whole question, I think, of also globalization as increasing trade and migration across borders occurs, like in the European Union, then what is the place of the nation state? What is the place of borders? I think all of these questions are not just prescient questions in the United States, but really throughout the world. In Europe right now, there are lots of countries which are dealing with this, and it's tearing these countries apart, because I think a lot of the issues that the three of you mentioned are at the stake. Does a nation need to have a common heritage and a common cultural identity? Can it just be a country that has a line on the border on the map, but then allows for free flow across that border in actuality? In the European Union, so far, that's the case, although that might be changing. And in the United States, the history up till the end of the 19th century was, of course, there was a line on the map, but there was no immigration restriction. Immigration restrictions begin with Chinese exclusion, and really the border, patrolling the border doesn't take off until the 1920s. So with that as the background, and again, I said that's where we're going to end up, let's go back to try to understand some of the history of this relationship between the United States and Mexico, and particularly focusing on the border. So what is this relationship? I would argue, and this is sort of obvious to state, but if you look over the last 150 years or so, it's been a relationship of conflict and cooperation. But one cannot understand that relationship without recognizing the imperial role that the United States has played in relationship to Mexico. So in other words, it's not just two parties who are having trading relationships and cultural communication and diplomacy, but it's one powerful nation which has exercised its will largely, or tried to exercise its will over a nation to the south. And so to understand that history is, you need to go back to the US-Mexico War, 1846-47, and that war was all about the border. The dispute was actually over where the border was. Mexico put it at a river north of the Rio Grande. The United States was arguing that the border was actually at the Rio Grande. And so in this sort of zone, the Nueces, what was called the Nueces Strip, President Polk moved his troops in. An American soldier was killed, provoking a war which really led to what the goal for the US was at that time, which was to occupy not only that strip, but the entire US West. So the result of the US-Mexico War was that the United States militarily and then through a treaty was able to occupy and take over half of Mexico's territory. So south of Oregon, but everything that we know, of course, is California, the US Southwest, was Mexico. So, you know, when the gentleman was talking about Texas and northern Mexico having a lot in common, it's because Texas was part of Mexico, was part of northern Mexico. In fact, there was the state of Texas y Coahuila was one political entity before that war. So the Mexicans who remained in what would become the United States then after the US-Mexico War were technically had the choice to become US citizens, but in fact what happened was their property was taken from them, they were discriminated against, and especially the old landowning elite was marginalized, and many of them were pushed across the border, chose to return back to Mexico. This all comes to a head at the end of the 19th and early 20th century when this region in the Southwest, especially South Texas, becomes economically important because they begin to move irrigation in and it becomes a place of US investment. And so as Anglo-Americans move into this region, there is the rapid displacement of Mexican landowners. And this is accompanied with vigilante violence. We're actually yesterday celebrating an anniversary of a hearing in Texas about this violence which happened in 1915, where hundreds of Mexicans were killed by Texas Rangers because of a fear of Mexican sedition, that Mexicans were going to come back and take over the US Southwest. In fact, there was a plan, a manifesto that called for Mexicans to rise up, take back their land. They were going to establish a republic for black people and for Indians, and the plan manifesto also called for the killing of all Anglo-Americans, males over the age of 16. So it was a pretty out there radical plan, but this ended up sparking a response by the Texas Rangers where lots of Mexicans who weren't involved in that revolt were killed. The larger point about that is this is a transformation of the region from one which had been controlled economically, politically, and culturally by Mexicans, Texas Mexicans, to one which increasingly became controlled by Anglo-Americans. You have to also look at what's going on in Mexico at this time. Late 19th century, there is a long-standing president / dictator named Porfirio Diaz who wanted to open up his country to investment, sort of pre-NAFTA. He invited US capitalists, British capitalists into the country. They built railroads. The Rockefellers and Guggenheims established mining interests in Mexico. This is when they begin oil explorations as well. And so that economic relationship then helps explain what comes next, which is migration, increasing migration to the United States. So the context for what we know of in the 20th century as Mexican migration to the United States is that there was already this pre-existing relationship with which the US had participated in, and it was encouraging, of tying the two countries together economically. So after the regime of Porfirio Diaz, which ends in 1911, the Mexican Revolution happens in 1911 to about 1920, that social dislocation and economic dislocation in Mexico sparks the first wave of massive migration to the United States. So people are looking to escape the violence in Mexico, but they're also looking for economic opportunities. Basically, the economy was destroyed by this massive revolution, which about a tenth of the population had either fled or was killed in Mexico. So that massive migration is happening, or the beginnings of that massive migration is happening at the same time that people in the United States are growing concerned about migration in general. There is an anti-immigration sentiment, hysteria in the country. The early 20th century is also the time at which we have historically the highest percentage of foreign-born people in the country. It reached about 14% in the 19-teens, which is that we're actually less than that today, but we're approaching those levels. So in that context then, and at that point, you only have immigration restrictions against Chinese laborers from 1882. You have other groups of people who are prevented from entering: convicts, people with diseases, prostitutes. So there are insane people who are labeled as insane were also prevented from coming in. But there were no other groups or countries that were restricted. In the 1920s, though, the government decides we need to really restrict immigration to this country. And they do it in a very specific way. It's not across the board, we just need to restrict immigration. It was very explicitly aimed to restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and Jews, and to include not only Chinese, but all other Asians and all African countries. So basically, what we're talking about is increasing the percentage of Northern European white migration, restricting non-white and Southern European and Eastern European people who were seen as not quite white, kind of off-white. So how do they do this? They actually go back to the 1890 census before that massive wave of Southern Europeans had come into the United States, and they say, okay, we'll go back to that date and say 2% of the population that existed in the country then, they'll have a quota. For the Chinese and for all these other countries, basically, you can't come in at all. So what happens to the Mexicans? What happens to the Latin Americans? Agribusiness in the Southwest is 100% dependent on Mexican labor, as they still are today. And so they lobby Congress to exempt the Western Hemisphere and Mexico from these immigration quotas. So in fact, when these racist national quotas begin in the 1920s, Mexicans are exempted. So Mexicans continue to come in, although there are other ways in which they're trying to restrict Mexicans through health inspections, literacy tests, et cetera. But in general, they're not part of those immigration restrictions. 1930 happens, the Great Depression, and all of a sudden you have all these Mexican laborers in the country, and people don't feel like there's economic competition, so there's a massive move to repatriate Mexicans. The Mexican government, coming out of the Mexican Revolution, actually participates in that repatriation. They think, great, all these people who've had experience living in the United States are the perfect workers to come back and develop the economy in Mexico. So it's a joint sort of cooperative agreement between the Mexican government and the US, who pushes out about 1 million Mexicans. These are not formal deportations. This is what they would call voluntary repatriation. But people are basically picked up and pushed across the border, including some people of Mexican descent who are US citizens and are just picked up along with the rest and pushed across the border. So you can start seeing in this history moments when the US is interested in Mexico and in Mexican labor, and then other moments when there's an economic crisis in the United States that they are not interested. So 1930, they push Mexicans out. 1940s comes along and you have World War II. All of a sudden, lots of men are off fighting the war in Europe, and they need laborers again. So they start the Bracero Program, which was a guest worker program to recruit agricultural laborers from Mexico, bring them into the United States under federal contracts so that they would, after their contracts were over, return to Mexico. And this program lasted from 1942 all the way up to 1964. And basically, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans were brought in under this program, encouraged to come in to work primarily in the agricultural sector. Early 1950s, there's another fear of there are too many Mexicans coming in. Mexicans who aren't going through the Bracero program are coming in illegally in an undocumented fashion. So they establish a program called Operation Wetback, where they round up, again, about 1 million Mexicans and send them back across the border. So all of this, you have this push and pull, which is dependent upon what's going on economically and politically in the United States. 1965 is the second major, after 1924, 1965, you have a major immigration act, the HardSell Our Act. This is part of the whole civil rights movement. And the goal of the HardSell Our Act is to eliminate the racist national origins quotas from 1924 and to try to establish more equity among the countries that, for their quotas. So they do that, and they establish a quota for the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, and then eventually they establish individual quotas for each country of 20,000 people. So for particular countries like Mexico, which had for decades 200,000 people coming in on an annual basis, what a 20,000 quota restriction meant was 1965 slammed the door shut on Mexican migration. So this progressive, liberal, civil rights step forward to get rid of racist restrictions actually had the unintended consequence of discriminating against what had been a traditionally large migration from Mexico. So what happens, these people have families, they have connections, they have communities in the United States, they've got economic interest in coming to the United States, so do they stop coming? No, they don't stop coming. They continue to come, but now they come as illegal aliens. And so you really begin to see after 1965, the emergence of the Mexican as the illegal alien. In the late 19th century, the image of the illegal alien was the Chinese worker who were crossing the borders clandestinely from Mexico, Canada, Cuba, and other places. But now it really becomes the Mexican. And then if we fast forward to the 1980s, there's another shift. 1980s is the period globally that people refer to as the sort of emergence of neoliberalism, which is essentially a return to classic 19th century liberalism, where the government is taking its hands out of the economy, more free trade, opening up of economies, restricting or shrinking the welfare state. And that process of neoliberal restructuring in Mexico, which is connected to a debt crisis which happens in 1980s, leads again to a massive uptick in immigration. And that, again, is not legal immigration. These people are just simply crossing the border, which at that point is still not tremendously fortified. So from the 1980s until today is really when you start to see the emergence of not only this uptick in migration, but an uptick in the enforcement of immigration control, border militarization, and detention and deportation. And in the 1990s, we actually reach a high of immigrants coming across the border and being caught coming across the border in an unauthorized fashion. So it's sometimes if you read the news, you would think that we're in an unprecedented moment of immigration, with everything that the president talks about. It's not true. And even immigration enforcement, it's not true. Under Clinton, there were way more people who were pushed out of the country. And so there's a distinction in immigration parlance of deportations, which are formal removal proceedings that go through the court, and removals, where you catch someone coming across the border and they're basically just sent back to Mexico. Under the Clinton era, in the Clinton era, you had the largest number of people removed. They weren't formally deported, they were just removed. Under Obama, you get the highest number of people formally deported, way higher than today under Trump. And this is something that I think most people would not sort of recognize just from the news and the rhetoric around it, but it's true. If you look at the numbers, the number of people deported then was way higher. So where are we today? We're in a situation where since 2009, there's actually negative net migration from Mexico. That means that more people, Mexicans, are returning to Mexico than are coming in. So where is the border crisis? There are clearly a lot of Central Americans coming, unaccompanied minors, whole families coming recently. That is somewhat of a crisis. But in terms of massive numbers of Mexicans flooding across the border, it just is just not happening. That is fake news. And this is not, you don't have to go to BuzzFeed to find this out. Go to the ICE statistics on people being apprehended coming across the border, any of the government statistics about migration. So what is going on then with this border wall? If there is actually a net negative migration from Mexico, why has this become such a big political issue? So I would argue that the border wall, and I don't think this is an original thought, is just a symbolic battle that Trump and others want to have as a monument to creating a country that is whiter and that has less, not only undocumented migration, but less legal migration. And it's very clear now, if we look in the last year and a half, that they're not only talking about stopping people from coming across the border illegally, they're talking about reducing the number of refugees, reducing the ability of people to apply for asylum, which is legally part of the U.S. Its legal structure, and also just in general reducing immigration. The lead guy, Stephen Miller, in the White House, sort of behind this immigration, comes from an organization called the Center for Immigration Studies, who very clearly have as their goal reducing legal immigration. So that clearly, it used to be in, 10, 15 years ago that George Bush, the younger, would talk about, we want to restrict and stop illegal immigration. Now I think we're on to a whole other kind of ball game where it's really about restricting legal immigration. So why is that there's this concern about reducing immigration? One could argue it has to do with the economy, although most economists agree that the immigration that the United States has received has been beneficial for the economy, has actually helped the growth rates by these working age immigrants coming in who we haven't have to pay for their education or their schooling all the time when they're not productive. They arrive as productive workers and do very low wage jobs, and then allow other people in the country who are American citizens to occupy higher rungs in the economic ladder. The United States economy, of course, is still today doing quite well. Unemployment is very low, so I don't think those economic arguments make any sense. The other argument, which I think is really at the root of it, is this fear of the demographic shift. So from 1920s to 1965, you have the country becoming whiter and more Northern European as a result of that 1924 Act. After 1965, you're getting much more immigration from Latin America, principally Mexico and Central America, and from Asia. So there is a demographic shift happening in this country. We all know this, that in the next 20, 30 years, white people will be a minority in this country. It's already happened in California. It's happening even in Oregon, a very white state. If you go outside of Portland, you go to the schools, the majority of young people in those schools are no longer white. They're from all over the world, but a lot from Latin America. That is causing some fear among people who believe that the core of what it is to be in the United States, or the core of the nation, what it means to be the United States, is being lost. And there is a whole range of people making that argument. Probably one of the most famous people to make this argument was a political scientist, Samuel Huntington, who was at Harvard, who argued this was the sort of Hispanic challenge, that it was a civilizational challenge, that the United States, which he argued was white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, was being challenged by the immigration and the lack of cultural assimilation of what he called Hispanics, Latinos, principally Mexicans in the United States. So that's the situation where we are today. In terms of the border wall, first of all, will not solve the problem of undocumented migration to the country. As many of you probably know, more than half of the people who are in this country without authorization come in on visas. So none of those people will be stopped by a wall. Furthermore, if you study the history of attempts to erect fences and other mechanisms to prevent people from crossing the border, immigrants are tremendously creative and inventive in going under the wall, going over the wall, going around the wall. These are very entrepreneurial people who are very motivated, and a wall will not stop them. El Chapo has made that very clear, that and the border fence never stopped him from getting the drugs across, and it is not going to stop people in Mexico from crossing, because the reason they're crossing is, again, tied into the economic relationship between the United States and Mexico. So we have to think about NAFTA and the effect of NAFTA on the agricultural sector in Mexico, which was to destroy it. So if you went to those communities in places like Oaxaca, where people were earning less than $1 a day, you have the choice between starving and your family starving, or taking the chance and leaving and crossing to the United States. You know you're going to do it illegally, but your choice is doing what you think is best for your family. Some people would argue, well, if those people want to come to the United States, they should stand in line. This is the sort of rhetoric, stand in line. The wait list for people from Mexico to stand in line, if you got in line today, assuming no new people got on that line, you'd be waiting 23 years. So simply, people would be dead, dying of starvation. Not all of that is the United States' fault, but there is an economic relationship between the two. So I think when we talk about migration and we talk about borders, we have to understand the history of the connection between the two. I don't know what's going to happen with the border wall. I doubt that it will ever be built. But it does serve a purpose. And the purpose is to create this idea. And the idea is of Fortress America, that America should be a white country, and that the people who are in this country, who are Latinos or are people who are identified as looking like immigrants, will be targeted, criminalized, and more easily exploited. And so I think that even though this is sort of a mythical wall, the effects are real in terms of the terror it's caused in immigrant communities. And so that's why it's an important debate, even though in some sense it's symbolic. So thank you. I'll stop there. And happy to take questions or comments.
A lot of interesting things. One remark you just made, which was of interest to me and I wasn't aware of, talked about NAFTA destroying farming in Mexico. Could you expand upon that just a bit?
Sure. So the NAFTA agreement, 1994, comes into effect. What it does is it reduces trade barriers between the U.S. and Mexico. So U.S., I'll give one example, corn, which is a staple in Mexico, has long cultural sort of important roots in Mexico. Corn, which is actually subsidized by the U.S. government in the United States and grown by Monsanto and able to be grown at very cheap prices, floods into the Mexican market. So all those people, largely many of whom are indigenous, who were, for millennia growing corn, all of a sudden they are competing with Monsanto. They can't compete with Monsanto. And so for the first time in its history, Mexico begins to import corn into the country for domestic consumption. So those people basically, the agricultural sector is hit very hard by that. And those people then flee to the cities and eventually to the United States. So the argument of NAFTA was that this was going to increase investment in manufacturing in Mexico. And to a certain extent, the Maquila sector, border assembly plants, did have growth during this period. But if you look actually at the 10 years before NAFTA and the 10 years after NAFTA, the manufacturing sector in Mexico grew at a slower rate after NAFTA. So there was growth, but it didn't have the intended impact on even the manufacturing sector. For the agricultural sector, it completely destroyed it. So NAFTA was not a great deal for Mexico, and the result of that was increasing pressure to migrate to the United States. So it's interesting now that NAFTA is being renegotiated. We'll see what the actual impact of that is, but the history up till now has been that.
Yeah, first, I want to thank you for the history. I didn't know much of that, and I appreciate it. I learned a lot. But when you got to the current day, do you have any idea how offensive it is to sum up opposing arguments as being racist?
Well, I'm sure it is offensive, but that's, I guess, let me turn this around and say, how would you characterize the comments by the president about Mexicans?
I'm not thinking about this question. I'm thinking about it's a matter, I think it's a matter of integrity. It's a matter of, we used to live abroad from Morocco. We knew many people who played by the rules, waited for green cards. It was a 23-year wait. They couldn't get in either. Yet for somehow or other, we allow, we say that there's a group of people who don't have to play by those same rules, who don't have to, they're national, don't have to be, don't have to participate in the integrity that we want. They're leaving their countries basically because of the chaotic, rule of law conditions, and by coming into their country, they become immediately disruptive to our own rule of law. And to say that that's a racist argument, I think it's just offensive.
Okay, I guess I would question everything you said up until they come into the country and disrupt our own rule of law. There's lots of arguments that people make that immigrants and undocumented immigrants commit crimes at high rates. That's just not true.
No, I'm not talking about that.
Okay, where are you talking?
I'm actually going to I'm going to stop this because we're not going to do a back and forth on this. I want a good question pertaining to the material we've been talking about, not a value judgment, not an opinion. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I appreciate you fielding it, but I want to move on because we have a lot of people in the room with questions. And I'll get you next.
So I'd just like to dial back and get some information, as if I can, on what you view as the important differences between informal removal and formal deportation. I get it that formal deportation adheres to the letter of the law. Are there other values to formal deportation that would make that desirable?
That's a really good question. So what happens, it's an important legal distinction because in formal deportation, the people are in general and increasingly put in detention. So the numbers of people, of immigrants in detention has been increasing dramatically. Today, I think the numbers are about 45,000 per day in immigrant detention. Over a course of a year under Obama was about 500,000 people, immigrants were in detention. So in terms of mass incarceration, that increases that experience. But those people, if they go into formal deportation proceedings, then have to go before immigration judges. And this is why, because we've increased formal deportations, we now have over 800,000 case backlog so I do expert witness testimony in asylum cases, and people who, for one reason or another, have their case postponed now are getting dates for 2023. So many of those people are out on parole, they're not in detention. Some of those people are in detention, will sit in prison for the next 3 or 4 years. Very expensive for this country to keep people in prison. Traumatic for the people who are in prison to be there. So I think that in that sense, the formal deportations, although there are some, you have to go through this formal proceeding, so in that way there are some kind of protections. The consequence is much greater. Plus, if you get formally deported then and you return, then that's a felony. And so you could be put in prison for much longer. If you're voluntary removal, you have different legal consequences.
Thank you. I realize that you were focusing primarily on how we got to where we are today, and maybe what I'm asking is a little bit unfair, but I wanted to know, it's two parts. One is if you could talk a little bit about why there has been a reversal in migration going outward, and then to take that a step farther and ask if you have any ideas for a system that would create more of a modus vivendi between the two countries, so you don't have this constant tension.
Yeah, great question. The first one was about the reverse. Oh, why is there? So demographers who've studied this argue that migrants basically leave between the age of 18 and 35. If you get to be a certain age, 40s, 50s, people are not picking up and leaving their country. They're established in their homes. They feel like they're towards the end of their economic sort of lives, and they just don't migrate as much. So what's happening demographically in Mexico is it's becoming older, and so there are just not as many people. The other thing that happened is in 2008, there was an economic crisis in the United States, so all of a sudden there weren't as many jobs, especially in construction, because housing was a key area, so people were leaving. The other factor was after 2001. Before 2001, essentially, Mexicans would cross illegally into the United States, live and work here, and then go back. Like, their goal was, in general, was not to necessarily come and stay in the United States. Their goal was to make money, enough money to go back and to survive in Mexico. So you had a lot of back and forth. After 2001, there is a lot more militarization of the border, which basically trapped people in the United States. In other words, if they were to go home for Christmas vacation, they weren't going to be able to get back in, or it was much more expensive and harder to come back in. So that also increased the number of people who remained here, but then when those people chose to leave, it wasn't sort of a back and forth. So the Mexican economy now is doing decently, although, as the gentleman in the front was mentioning, there's tremendous political violence that related to drug cartels, and so the asylum claims that I'm dealing with are people who are having threats. Their partners have had their heads cut off, and they've, people being tortured by serious, thugs and gangs. And so those people, that political violence, 200,000 people have been killed in this drug war in Mexico in the last 10 or so years. So the people being affected by that are also fleeing political violence in Mexico. So, but I think the demographics and the economic crisis in the United States largely explains why it's a net negative migration.
Actually, a follow-up on the latter half of the question here on modus vivendi, if you will. Could you speak to whether there is a guest worker program still in existence, what percentage that might represent of folks, coming to work here, and was something like that, or a well-implemented E-Verify system help support the reality of the economic integration?
So the first question, there is H-2B visas. So high-tech workers could come in, temporary workers come in as guest workers to the United States. The number of those visas is very small, and recently they had a lottery, and within the first minute, there were, the whole server crashed because there were more people trying to get those workers. So the kind of workers who work at ski resorts up in Mount Hood, I've been up there, and some of them are from Argentina. They come in on these temporary workers. You don't have the agricultural, large-scale agricultural guest worker program like you had in the Bracero period. So the question of should we roll out, this has been one of the proposals, roll out big guest worker programs, bring people in, and then ship them back. I think it raises a larger question of how we view immigrants. Are immigrants just to be viewed as workers who come and serve an economic function in this country, or are they going to be viewed as people who are whole people, who have families and relationships, and who would benefit by integrating into our society? And I would argue that that's the route we want to go. We don't want to create, I would argue, we don't want to create in the United States second-class citizens without the rights that the rest of us have, and who are just seen as workers. In terms of E-Verify, yeah, E-Verify, I don't think it would help the integration. I think it would end up identifying those people who are here illegally and make it harder for them. But by making it harder for them, it also becomes easier to exploit those people in underground economies. This is sort of the history of legislation. Whenever you make anything illegal, like alcohol or marijuana, an illegal economy, those people are going to be here, they're going to be looking for work, but they're going to be pushed farther into the shadows.
Might not E-Verify put the onus on employers to figure out some kind of accommodation?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
In a guest worker or some, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in fact, big business has been one of the, and I think probably going forward, is one of the most powerful lobbies for immigration because they depend on it, especially agricultural businesses depend on it. So yeah, if all the hotels and all the agricultural enterprises actually had to, make sure they had legal workers, then they would have a hard time finding staff, and that might politically push them to this, to find a solution. But I would just say, politically, where we're at, 75% of the people in the United States are in favor of immigration, of continuing immigration, more immigration. It is a very loud minority of people who happen to be the base of our current president who have a different view. But the vast majority of Americans actually are not in favor of these policies. I just think it's this particular moment we're in now where they have managed to shift the, or put power behind that, that anti-immigrant sentiment.
Just kind of the same kind of a question, but are there any serious efforts by either house, okay, or anywhere in the legislature to actually solve this in some kind of a comprehensive manner? Any bills, any, what? No, I mean, that's what you wanted. Is
that a rhetorical question? No, I mean, there have been efforts, there have been long efforts for years and years to try to have comprehensive immigration reform. And I mean, who knows, one scenario is that this whole border wall thing ends up somehow in moving the pieces around and resulting in comprehensive immigration reform. And if that happens, I would be pleasantly surprised. I just don't see it happening because I think that the polarized sides are so far apart in terms of one side really wanting to reduce legal immigration and the other side seeing legal immigration and immigration in general as a good thing. I mean, the ICE, the Homeland Security, for the first time took away the phrase "a nation of immigrants." I never thought that would happen in this country, where I thought, that was the baseline, is we all understood that unless you're a Native American here, we are all immigrants. This is a nation of immigrants. So to take that phrase out all of a sudden suggests to me that there's a clear, I mean, I'm not making this up, but there's anti-immigrant sentiment in the government. And it's expressed over and over again in a variety of different ways. How you want to characterize it, I guess, is up to each individual. But it's certainly saying immigration is something we should restrict and control. I'm noticing most of our comments have been from Ben, so maybe we could focus on some more.
Hi. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Maquiladora industry, its history, and its impact on both countries and the current status.
Yeah, so the border industrialization program begins in 1965, and it's in fact right after that the Bracero Program ends. And the idea, the Mexican government is like, what are we going to do with all these people who can't go to the United States now? We need to start a manufacturing sector. And so they begin to build plants along the border. The idea is this assembly happens in Mexico so the US companies could take advantage of cheap labor, ship the goods back across without tariffs, and it would develop Mexico. So initially, the wages in the Maquiladora sector are higher than in the other parts of Mexico. So that encouraged people, largely women initially, to go to these border regions and get these jobs in these factories. The problem is that the cost of living on the border is also much more expensive. So people went there. There's all sorts of problems with sexual harassment, assault with these young women. There's huge rates of femicide, of young women being killed who are working in these maquiladora plants. And a lot of those people who worked in the maquiladoras eventually tried to cross. And because the situation of working in those factories was not, even though they were making higher wages, if you cross the border, you could make a lot more. So today, the maquiladora sector still exists. It's actually not just along the border now. They've established those factories throughout Mexico. There is a lot of manufacturing going on in Mexico. The question is, what the manufacturing sector, what are they doing? So a lot of it's not sort of research and development. A lot of it's just manual intensive stuff. So our coupons, I went down to a border town, to a maquiladora, the coupons that you give in at Safeway, it's cheaper for them to send all those coupons down to Mexico to have people manually sort them in a plant there than it is to do it in the United States. So stuff like that, it's giving people a wage, but it's, in terms of developing an economy, today it's not even manufacturing, it's the service sector, it's the financial sector where most of the money is made. So in terms of the long-term future for Mexico, I don't think the maquila sector, certainly up till now, hasn't served to transform the Mexican economy. I think, but that was the intent. So it was a Mexican government connected with U.S. business and the U.S. government attempt to develop Mexico. So I think I forgot to respond to the question about what could be done in terms of in the future from the U.S. government perspective on this issue. And I think the U.S. government needs to, if the U.S. government realized that the Mexican economy is why we have migration and the political situation as well, why we have migration to the United States, and we saw an interest in developing Mexico in a way that people weren't forced out, then I think that the long-term situation would resolve itself. So there are libertarians who argue there should be no borders because the market will figure it out. That if you have lots of Mexicans come into the people coming across the border of the United States, then it'll be in the U.S. interest to develop Mexico. So that, if we think about, like in Europe, the European Union gave tons of money to Spain, to develop Spain, which was a less developed economy because they thought of it as part of their obligation. And there was also free migration between parts of Europe. So NAFTA was only about the free trade of goods. It never dealt with the migration issues. So I think if we had a new NAFTA, it should also be, if we're going to have free movement of goods, we should have freer movement of people as well.
So I hate to sound like your therapist, but we're up. Our time is up for today. I like this. Does anyone know the great political geographer? He once said, "Something is there that doesn't love a wall," is the opening line of Robert Frost's Mending Wall. But I want to bring back to the question that you started with, which was, is a country without its borders? Because my mind initially went right to the Korzybski quote about the map is not the territory. And what you just ended on sort of illustrates that point, that maybe we are at a point where the border is a porous concept, and it is a vestige of a world that no longer exists in our so-called flattened economy. Do you think we're going to ever get to that point in a political or a larger cultural discussion here, kind of like the EU?
Well, as a historian, I would say the nation state is a historically constructed concept that emerged in the 18th and 19th century. It is not always going to be with us, even though it's hard to imagine that nation states as we know them today won't exist. At some point, just like us and capitalism, we will move on to something else. And so what that something else will look like, I'm not a soothsayer, but just knowing that and looking at, as you're saying, the increasing trade and movement of people and transfer of ideas through the internet, it does seem that borders and walls are a vestige more of our past than of our future.
Thank you very much. Big hand for Elliott. Remember to buy your tickets for the speaker series, because otherwise you will not be able to get in. That is one border that is real.
Offensive.